What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Normally, I would have a video today that's a review as part of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge, but I accidentally scheduled today's video to upload last week. So there was one day last week where you got two reviews that were part of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. So, no review today, but I felt like you needed a video from me anyway. I wanted to go ahead and give you something to upload for today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about King Arthur. King Arthur is one of my passions. It's something that I like quite a bit. It's something that I discovered relatively recently. I'm a big superhero fan, but most of the superhero characters and teams that I like are things that I have liked for my entire life. Batman and the X-Men are things that I've liked since I can remember. But King Arthur is something that I didn't really come to love in the way that I love now until the last 5 years or so, maybe a little bit longer than that, but I am a huge King Arthur fan, and unfortunately it seems like I'm the only one. It seems like every time there's a chance that we are going to get a new TV series or a new movie that's going to kick off a new franchise of sequels and such, it seems like that falls completely on its face and then we don't get that. We had the Starz Camelot series, which I reviewed sometime back, and I liked it quite a bit, and then that only lasted one season. It was like 9 or 10 episodes, and then fairly recently, earlier this year, about a month or two ago, we had Guy Ritchie's Legend of the Sword, or Legends of the Knights of the Round Table. It went through a couple of different name changes. That was allegedly supposed to kick off a 6-part series of films that were all going to be part of the King Arthur shared universe, and I remember when they first announced that that was going to be a thing, that they were going to do multiple movies all using the same actors and they were all going to be part of the same continuity. I remember when they first announced that, I came up with my own idea for what I would have done if the network or if the company came to me and said, here's $10 billion, you need to make 6 King Arthur movies, what are you going to do? I had some very rough, not very well or deeply thought out ideas. These were just the very vague, broad ideas. Almost none of these would be able to sustain their own movie. You would have to flesh it out and add a whole lot of B-plot and add a whole lot to the A-plot in each of these instances. But basically, since it looks like we are never ever going to get that King Arthur series of movies that I was hoping that we would get, because this latest Guy Ritchie King Arthur movie, it bombed, no one liked it, and we are most certainly not going to get sequels to that. I would be very surprised if we are. Since we're not going to get that, and it's probably going to be at least 5 years since we get our next King Arthur movie, I'm just going to go ahead and give you guys a rough outline of what I would do in a 6-part King Arthur movie franchise. I'm just going to be reading these off to you guys, letting you know what I would do. So starting off with movie 1, Uther, Arthur's dad, has just died, and Arthur, he pulls the sword from the stone, and then you've got a whole bunch of different kings like Leodegrance and Pellinore. They support Arthur immediately as soon as he pulls the sword from the stone, but then you have other kings like Lot and Urien. They do not support Arthur, and so there's a big war where about half of the kings ally themselves with Lot and Urien, and then about half of the kings ally themselves with Arthur, along with Leodegrance and Pellinore. And then you've got Morgan, who is Urien's wife and was once upon a time Merlin's apprentice. Merlin, of course, was instrumental in getting Arthur onto the throne. We wouldn't start with Uther having the kid and being at war with Gorlois, who was Morgan's birth father. We wouldn't start with any of that, but we would get a lot of that stuff in backstory and flashback further into the movie. So Morgan, Urien's wife, she comes to Arthur and basically begs him, do not start this war. Please, if you are as good of a king as Merlin says you are going to be, if you are as noble and just and pure-hearted as you claim that you are, please find another way to prevent this big war. And she's about 8 years older than Arthur, I'm guessing. If you are a big fan of King Arthur, you know that she is Arthur's half-sister, but she and Arthur do not know that they are related at this point. She says, please do not have this war. You don't know what it's like. I grew up here in the middle of everything. It's basically been just one long series of wars for as long as I can remember. You grew up kind of out in the middle of nowhere where you grew up. You weren't really touched by these wars. You don't know what it was like. Please do not continue this long strain of wars. And Arthur's like, you know what? You have a good point. I'm going to try to do what you said. I'm going to try to not let this turn into a war. Of course, it doesn't work out that way. Lot and Urien are not going to let this end peacefully. They do not want as far as they're concerned, this kid who isn't even old enough to shave to be sitting on the throne. And Lot, while he probably knows that Arthur is actually Uther's kid, Lot was actually Uther's general. He was kind of in charge of his army when Uther was still alive. So he knows Uther. He knows that he couldn't keep it in his pants. So he probably is thinking, yeah, this kid actually is Uther's kid. But publicly, he's going to say, as far as we know, Merlin just pulled this kid out of nowhere. We don't even know if he's actually Uther's kid. So Lot especially is not going to take this sitting down. So he and Urien basically turn this into a war. And then Arthur and Merlin, unfortunately, they're like, yeah, we're going to have to fight. We're going to actually have to let this become a war. But before that happens, Arthur and Morgan, they have kind of gotten close with each other a little bit over these last couple of days where Morgan is trying to convince him not to do this. And they wind up sleeping together. And let me remind you, they do not know that they are half siblings, but they end up sleeping together. And then the next morning, Arthur has to go off to war. Eventually, Lot gets killed by King Pellinore, and that kind of becomes important for his family and Lot's family long down the line. Urien, he ends up surrendering, and then Morgan, she basically runs away, and she's disenchanted with Arthur and this new age of, air quotes, peace. Arthur ends up becoming the new king. Nobody is disputing this anymore, and then it's more or less a happy ending, except that if you are familiar with the legends, then you know that Morgan is not happy about this, and she is going to do something about what she sees as this big betrayal. She is very interested in protecting the people and making the land be a land of peace, but now she is going to basically become a ends justifies the means kind of character, and if she happens to be the one that's in charge, that's okay, but ultimately she sees Arthur as a threat to the people that she is going to have to remove. So my fix for doing basically all of Arthur's career as King of Great Britain, the High King over everyone else, is that with 6 movies, each movie takes place 4 years after the previous movie. I don't remember if it was in Le Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Malory or if it was in The Once and Future King by T.H. White, but one of those 2 stories placed Arthur's entire career as king at about 25 years. And in the first movie, I would have Arthur as being about 16 years old. Some versions of the story have had him be a lot younger. For example, the animated Sword and Stone movie had him as like 8 or 9, and then the Star Wars Camelot series had him as probably a little older than 16, maybe 20 or 22, something like that. I would have him be 16. That's usually the age that I see him being when he first pulls the sword from the stone in most stories. So movie 2 is now 4 years later. Arthur is now married to Leo de Grance's daughter, Guinevere, but it's a political marriage. They don't actually love each other. They like each other okay, but it's not a romantic love. Basically, they just married each other to kind of get this ball rolling. They're going to try and produce an heir because that's very important, especially back then. Because you went through kings pretty fast at that time. They were really more like warlords than actual kings. You could go in one generation through 3 kings pretty easily. So they want to go ahead and try and produce an heir as early as possible. And if you are familiar with the stories of King Arthur, you know that Arthur and Guinevere never actually have a kid. There could be many different reasons for that. I'm going with Guinevere is barren. Lancelot, the son of a French king named Ban, he has come to the kingdom in between movies, and he is very loyal to Arthur. And I am going with the idea that Arthur is aware that Lancelot and Guinevere are sleeping together, but he is not going to do anything about it. He and Lancelot are very close. They're basically the closest thing they have to best friends with each other. And Arthur, while he does not get any romantic love from Guinevere, he does love her. He loves both of these people, and he sees that they are happy with each other, so he is not going to do anything to interfere with these two having an affair. But the affair has not actually started yet. That's something that I would want to hold off until later movies. Basically, we want to get to know these characters a little bit before we are thrust into the middle of this love triangle. Lancelot, he believes in Arthur because Arthur supports the old religions as well as the newer Christian ways. Arthur is pretty much okay with whatever religion anyone wants to serve as long as it doesn't mean harm for other people. And Lancelot is from a house divided. His father was a Christian king, but his father died some years ago, probably before the events of the first movie, and then Lancelot was raised by the Lady of the Lake, who is a fairy, and she raised him on Avalon to become the best knight in the world. So Lancelot, he's kind of got one foot in each door. And so that's Lancelot. And then Guinevere, she very much does not trust magic. She is very much with this new Christian religion. She doesn't like magic. She doesn't trust Merlin. If Morgan was here, she wouldn't trust Morgan. She doesn't like any of this magic stuff, but she is going to allow Arthur to make whatever choices he's going to make. She doesn't really have a say in that. But if it was up to her, she would be outlawing the old ways and saying we are now officially a Christian nation. So the bad guy of this movie is Morgan, who has forged an alliance with the Fae to depose Arthur. Remember, Morgan was a pupil to Merlin before she met Arthur, and she still has some of that magical training, just enough to be able to contact the fairies, or the Fae, and now she is pretty powerful on her own, with the Fae supporting her, and obviously she's still pretty angry that Arthur and Merlin were all about, we can be better than this, but then they stoop to, let's all kill Lot and be done with it pretty fast. So her plan is to kill Arthur and somehow install her husband Urien onto the throne so that she can then control him in an era of actual peace. Merlin and Morgan, they have a confrontation. Morgan, of course, never really liked Merlin since he helped get her father killed before Arthur was born, and we would find out all of that stuff in the first movie, and we would be getting a little bit more of it in this movie, but from Morgan's perspective, because Merlin helped Uther seduce Morgan's mother, and then that indirectly got Morgan's father Gorlois killed. So obviously, even though Morgan studied under Merlin, that was mostly just in pursuit of her own power. She doesn't actually like Merlin for the obvious reasons. So Merlin knows the future, but he cannot change it, which is going to make Merlin a very crusty, crabby old man, because he knows that Arthur's kingdom is going to fall apart, and he knows exactly why it's going to fall apart, but he can't go up to Lancelot and slap him in the face and say, don't sleep with the queen. Even though he knows exactly what is going to happen, he is bound by Babylonian law to not actually do anything to interfere with how history is going to unfold. But when Merlin and Morgan have their little confrontation, Morgan is going to use her dark magic to peer into Merlin's mind, and Merlin is counting on that happening. In the future that he sees, Morgan has renounced her ways and is now an ally of Arthur. We don't know exactly when that's going to happen, but it's going to happen sometime in the future. And Morgan of now is not happy with what she sees, but this is more or less what's going to send her on her way in this movie, where she is going to think long and hard about what to do next. We won't see her for a while, but presumably she will have more run-ins with Arthur and his knights in between movies and in some of the later movies. So that would basically be the end of this movie. Like I said, we would have to add a lot of stuff to these movies, a lot of stuff with the B-plot, introducing some minor characters, characters like Pelinor's son, Lamorak, stuff like that. We would have to introduce a lot of stuff to kind of pad this out, because like I said, a lot of the plots that I came up with here were very basic and just getting to the point. It wouldn't be enough to sustain a movie by itself. Moving on to the third movie, this is once again 4 years later. Merlin has been gone for a little while now. He has been trapped in a crystal cave by his lover, who is the new lady of the lake, Nimue. Nimue is now Arthur's new mystical advisor. Basically, I would play her as being very young and naive and very innocent, as opposed to Merlin, who is very old and crabby and just a curmudgeon in general. She's basically the exact opposite of Merlin. Her powers are a little different than how Merlin's powers worked, but she is still basically serving the same function that Merlin was serving in the previous two movies. Meanwhile, you have Prince Malagant, who is the son of one of Arthur's supporters from the first movie, King Bagdemagus. Malagant kidnaps Guinevere, so now Arthur, who knows that Lancelot and Guinevere have been sleeping together for a little while now, he has chosen not to take any action, like I said, because he knows that this will tear the kingdom apart, and he knows that this is what makes Lancelot and Guinevere happy, so he doesn't want to ruin that for his two dear friends. But he and Lancelot are going to work together to try and rescue Guinevere. Of course, Lancelot is going to fight against this. He says, you know, I'm the best knight in the world. I could probably go save her. And Arthur's like, no, she's my wife. I have to make sure that she's okay. By this point, definitely, Arthur loves Guinevere, but he knows that she will never love him back. But he has to go and make sure that she's okay. So he's going to go in disguise. Obviously, if Arthur's sitting on the throne wearing these really nice duds, everyone is going to know that that's King Arthur. But if he puts on a dirty cloak and kind of covers his face, maybe shaves, no one's necessarily going to say, hey, that's King Arthur. But Nimue and Lancelot, they're not happy about this, but there's really nothing that they can do about this. So Arthur, he insists, and he goes along with them. He disguises himself as Clegus, who was an actual Arthurian character in one of the stories where Guinevere was kidnapped, and he, in the story, helped Lancelot rescue Guinevere. In this, I'm saying that Clegus is probably a knight somewhere, and Arthur is just using his identity for now to help Lancelot rescue Guinevere. By the end of the movie, Lancelot knows that Arthur knows, but neither one of them is willing to spoil what's going on here. So basically, Lancelot knows and Arthur knows, and they probably both know that the other one knows, but it's a very much a wink-wink, nod-nod kind of relationship. And this would be a really good instance where we could have Arthur and Lancelot have a lot of nights by the campfire where they're talking to each other about where they see their lives going and stuff like that. Of course, Arthur pretty much sees his life ending on the throne. He doesn't really see much changing for him, but Lancelot, you know, he talks about how maybe he would like to start a family someday, and that kind of hints at the possibility of Galahad existing in later movies. We would get to see these these two develop as friends, which even though we introduced Lancelot in the previous movie, we didn't necessarily get to see him and Arthur be buddies in that movie. But here, we would get to see a little bit more of that. And then eventually they would have to kill Malagant because he is just going to keep trying to get with Guinevere. He has this weird, unhealthy obsession with her, so they're going to have to eventually kill him. But then the day is saved by the end of the movie where Guinevere is rescued, and then everything is peaches and cream. So the next movie, movie 4, once again takes place 4 years later. I finally decided that this one should be an anthology movie. Whenever I was first coming up with all of these plots, this one was the hardest one for me to figure out what to do. I thought about doing the Gawain and the Green Knight story, but that's pretty much just Gawain's story. Arthur doesn't really feature in that story very much at all. He's about as important as M is in a James Bond movie. He sends Gawain off on his mission, and then Gawain goes on the mission. Arthur's not really a very central character in that. Guinevere and Lancelot aren't even in that story at all. And of course, you could embellish and add to that story a little bit, but I didn't really want to do that. I wasn't really sure what to do that would feature Lancelot, Arthur, and Guinevere in very heavy roles. And then I decided I don't have to do that. If I'm doing 6 movies, I can take my time and play around with some of these other characters. So I could do a story with Palomedes going after the questing beast, or I could have the story of Gawain and his brothers going after Lamorak because of the perceived blood feud between their family and his family. Pellinore is Lamorak's father, and Pellinore killed Gawain's father, Lot, so you're going to have some conflict there. Maybe you could do a story of Lancelot finding out that he is going to be a father, and that Galahad is probably 8 or 9 at this point. I'm not really sure how old he would need to be in order for him to be a knight in some of the later movies, but you could have Lancelot finding that out. Preferably, I would like to keep Lancelot, Guinevere, and Arthur at kind of minimal roles in this movie. They would probably show up, but they wouldn't have very large roles at this point. You would really want to take this moment to really explore some of your other characters who normally don't get a whole lot to do in King Arthur movies. Most of the time, in most movies, you're going to have Merlin, Lancelot, Guinevere, Arthur, maybe Morgan Le Fay, and then everyone else pretty much just goes to the side and doesn't really get to do anything. I would really want to take this opportunity to kind of play around with that. Do a quick little story where maybe Dagonet, he kind of intersects with Gawain, and then later maybe he intersects with Gareth's storyline, and you can kind of have some of these stories cross over with each other a little bit. You could have Kay go and fight a giant. There's all sorts of really fun stuff that you could do in this movie. It wouldn't necessarily fit in with the overall arc of the 25-year reign, but it would be really fun to play around with it and do something unexpected for this movie. Movie 5 is 4 years later once again. This movie would focus on the Grail quest, where basically every knight in the kingdom is searching for the Holy Grail. By this point, they pretty much defeated all of their enemies. They pretty much turned the land into a utopia, so they don't really have anything going on. So when they find out that the Grail quest is a thing that is going to happen and the Holy Grail is attainable, pretty much everyone wants to be the one who brings that to the kingdom. Of course, only one person can do it, the most pure noble knight, and that is eventually going to be Galahad, Lancelot's son, but you've got a couple of other knights who are really close to finding the Grail. Percival, who is another son of Sir Pellinore, and then you've got some other knights, Sir Bors, who is Lancelot's cousin. You've got a couple knights who are close to finding the Grail, but ultimately it's going to be Galahad. This is going to be the beginning of the fall of Camelot, because when you have 150 knights all searching for the Holy Grail, and they are told in no uncertain terms that only the most pure noble knight can find the Grail, and then they can't find it, that's going to do wonders for destroying their morale. So basically everyone is going to be really bitter and angry that only one of them can find a Grail, and they are not it. There's only one, and it's Galahad. So they're all going to be pretty upset about that. This is also around the time when a lot of knights are going to be dying, fighting each other. In some of the sources, Gawain killed a bunch of people during the Grail. Now, I really like Gawain a lot, and I don't want him to be quite as bloodthirsty and vengeful as he is sometimes portrayed in movies, so I would try to tone down a lot of the murders that he commits in some of the stories that are not by me. But even though I don't want Gawain to necessarily be bloodthirsty and outright cold-blooded in how he kills people, he is going to kill some people. For example, Palomedes, who was a tutor to Gawain and his brothers back when Lot was still alive, he has been a knight with Gawain for a long time, and somehow they are going to come to a misunderstanding where Gawain is going to end up killing Palomedes. He would probably regret it afterwards, but it's something where at the time he felt like there was no other option, and then he kills Palomedes, and then he regrets it. That's kind of how I see Gawain. Gawain, where he thinks with his heart and then he ends up making a decision that's very rash, but at the time he feels like there's no other way to do it. Now, one thing to keep in mind about the Grail Quest is that once upon a time, the stories about King Arthur and his knights weren't necessarily about knights who acted with Christian values. A lot of these stories were written just a couple of centuries after Arthur allegedly existed. If Arthur did exist, it would have been around the turn of the 5th century, and a lot of these stories didn't start until about the 8th century, so it wasn't too much longer after he allegedly existed. And it wasn't until roughly the Middle Ages, during the Crusades, when you started to see writers really influence these stories with a lot of Christian tones. So the Grail Quest originally was about some Welsh magical artifact that was just a healing cauldron, and then eventually it becomes the cup that captured the blood of Jesus Christ and what he drank from at the Last Supper. So that's something that you could play around with. Maybe Nimue says, yeah, it's not necessarily the cup that Christ drank from, it's really more of a magical item, but then you have other people like Lancelot and Galahad saying, maybe it is the cup that Christ drank from at the Last Supper. You could kind of play around with the idea that this is a world where the magical old ways and the newer Christian ways are kind of at war with each other, and then some of the knights aren't really sure what to think. Maybe it is what Nimue says, maybe it's not. That would be something that I would want to play around a little bit with in this movie. So this one ends with Galahad finally capturing the Grail, and Morgan, she is there, and she witnesses a host of angels come and they take Galahad into heaven. This is how it happens in a couple of the different stories with Galahad on the Grail Quest, and this is what's going to turn Morgan back to the side of the good guys, so to speak. Basically, she is going to be so moved by the purity of this event that she is moved to tears, and she realizes that she has been wasting most of her life as an enemy of Arthur when she could be protecting the land and acting in Arthur's interests and saving the people. She realizes that she was being a little bit petty and that she could have been helping him this whole time, and maybe things could have been even better than they are right now. So this movie would end Morgan as an antagonist of Arthur, and she would once again become an ally to the kingdom. And that would be roughly where I would end the 5th movie. The 6th movie is the very end of Camelot, the fall of everything. This is where everyone finds out that shortly before Arthur pulled the sword, he had sex with his half-sister and produced an illegitimate heir. Bum, bum, bum. I realized that I didn't even mention Mordred being born in any of these movies before this, so I think it would be kind of cool to just all of a sudden say, there's this guy named Mordred, he's about 20 years old, give or take, and he has been kind of hiding out with Morgan's sister this entire time. The thing about Mordred is he is one of the oldest King Arthur characters. Back in like the 800s, or even before that, in the Gododin Chronicle, basically all we knew was there was a guy named Arthur and there was a guy named Mordred, and they fought in the Battle of Camlan, and that's really the earliest King Arthur story, and it's only like one sentence long, but Mordred is one of the oldest King Arthur characters, and so he has gone through quite a few changes depending on who is writing him. Sometimes he is just an unrepentant bad guy, sometimes he's very misunderstood, and he does what he does for what he feels like is a good reason. I would kind of want to go along with that interpretation of the character. I don't want him to just be a malicious bad guy who's twirling his mustache. My first encounter with the character of Mordred was from the 1998 Merlin miniseries with Sam Neill, and in that, Mordred was just 100% evil. He did not have any redeeming qualities. I would want him to basically be an angry teenager who doesn't see himself ever being as good as what his father wants him to be, and obviously his father is not going to be as disappointed in Mordred as Mordred thinks that he is, but there's going to be a disconnect between these two characters because Mordred grew up with his aunt Morgause, and I'm going to reveal through flashback and exposition that when Mordred was born, Morgan basically said, I don't have time to raise a kid, I have to try and bring Arthur down so that I can take control of the kingdom. So she goes to her sister Morgause, who is the mother of Gawain and his brothers and the ex-wife of Lot, and she says, hey, can you raise my baby? And Morgause says, yeah. And so Mordred has grown up in a household where Morgause is constantly talking about how awful Arthur is because he allowed her husband to die. And then he knighted her husband's killer, Pellinore, and Pellinore became a knight of Arthur. So Morgause was never really happy with Arthur. So Mordred has grown up with all of that. But even so, his half-brothers slash cousins, Gawain, Agravain, Gareth, and Gaheris, they are all knights of the kingdom. And eventually, Mordred wants to become a knight too. And then when he eventually finds out that Arthur is his father, he's going to want to try and form a relationship there. And of course, around this time, you've got Agravain, who for quite some time has suspected that Lancelot and Guinevere are sleeping together. He is going to try and reveal this. And somehow I'm going to have Mordred basically become disenchanted with Arthur in a very similar set of misunderstandings that Morgan became became disenchanted with Arthur back in the first movie. And he is basically going to say, you know what, I'm with Agravain, we need to reveal their treachery to the kingdom, we need to show Arthur that these two are betraying him and the rest of the kingdom. And Mordred probably doesn't realize that Arthur is aware of what's going on and he doesn't want everyone else to know. But then once they do finally reveal that Lancelot and Guinevere are sleeping together, Arthur is put in between the rock and a hard place. If he pardons Guinevere, basically he is saying that it's okay if everyone commits treason and these laws have no meaning. So he has to say, yeah, we're going to burn Guinevere at the stake. And by this point, Lancelot, he escapes whenever they find these two in flagrante delicto, and then he is going to come back and rescue Guinevere. And I kind of like the idea that maybe Arthur mystically contacted Lancelot somehow using Nimue help, and he said, hey, we're going to be burning Guinevere at the stake on this day. Maybe you would like to come and rescue her. I really don't want to see my wife burned at the stake, but you understand that politically I had to do it. And so Lancelot is going to go and he's going to rescue Guinevere, and during this rescue attempt, he ends up killing a whole bunch of knights who are somehow going to find out that Lancelot is coming to save her. He kills all of Gawain's brothers and Gawain's sons. Gawain is not going to be happy about this, and Gawain, who is already a little bit of a hothead anyway, is going to be absolutely livid that Arthur just wants to put all this behind him. Arthur is probably going to go up to Gawain and say, hey, I understand, and Gawain's going to be like, don't you even dare. Your wife and your best friend are still alive. My entire family is now dead because of your best friend and because of your refusal to do anything about their treachery this entire time. So Gawain basically takes his badge and just throws it on the ground and says, I quit, and so he is going to go to war with Lancelot, and eventually Gawain is somehow going to get killed. I don't think that Lancelot is going to kill him, but I'm not really sure how I would have that play out. But Gawain is going to end up dying, and then with his dying breath, he's going to realize that Lancelot, even though he did kill his entire family, he's not as bad of a guy as Gawain was thinking, and he's basically, as he dies, asking Lancelot for forgiveness. And then meanwhile, Mordred, who is kind of acting in the best interest of the kingdom, or at least he thought he was, he kind of agrees with Gawain as Gawain is leaving. He's saying, you know what, Arthur, Gawain was right. You let all of this happen. All of this is on your hands, and now you're basically trying to put all this together. You don't deserve to have this kingdom. I am the prince. I am your only heir. I deserve to have this kingdom. And Mordred is saying, there are a whole bunch of knights here who are all really angry at you. I bet several of them would follow me, and then you've also lost several knights who have gone and followed Lancelot because they're also kind of angry at you, and they like Lancelot, and they think that he's a really good guy, and that all of this is kind of a misunderstanding, and that he's not to blame. So basically, your entire kingdom has fallen apart. They've either gone with Lancelot, or they're willing to follow me. You don't have a whole lot of knights left. So Mordred is basically giving Arthur an ultimatum, saying, you need to give me the kingdom. You need to step back and just let me handle this from now on. And Arthur, up until this point, he's been trying to handle things with grace and aplomb, but he is not going to just hand over the kingdom to his illegitimate son. He says, you know what, Mordred, you want the kingdom, come and take it. So there's going to be a big, huge war between Arthur and Mordred, and just when you think that the friendship between Arthur and Lancelot is over because Lancelot took Guinevere and left and killed some of Arthur's best knights, Lancelot finds out that this big war is happening largely because of him and Guinevere's indiscretions. Lancelot and his followers all come to help Arthur out, and this is where we would have the best battle scene in cinematic history. Every knight dies except for Bedivere, Morfans, and Sandif. These guys are the only ones who survive for various reasons, and then Arthur, with his dying breath, he says to Bedivere, hey, take Excalibur, I want you to throw it back into the lake. Give it back to the Lady of the Lake, who, for whatever reason, Nimue left shortly before the war started, so she's back in the lake, she's back at Avalon, and with some reluctance, Bedivere finally does throw the sword into the lake, and then the movie ends with Morgan and Nimue and some of the Avalonian queens coming on a barge to take Arthur to Avalon, where he will be kept in suspended animation until his land needs him once again. And that's basically what I would do with 6 King Arthur movies. It's not perfect, but I think that that would be a pretty awesome franchise of movies. It takes basically all the stuff from multiple different sources of King Arthur that I love, and it combines it all in a way that I think would work pretty well. You've got different stuff from L'Amour de Arthur, The Once and Future King. You've got other stories that people aren't as familiar with, and I think that you can take the best elements from all of those stories and combine it into one huge epic, and I think that it would be pretty awesome. Obviously, I'm probably the only one who thinks that because we still don't have a King Arthur series of movies. We still don't have a TV series going on right now. We had the Merlin TV series from the BBC, but that wasn't that good in my opinion, and that was really the most recent successful TV series that we had. Other than that, we have a movie once every 5 to 10 years, but we haven't really had a good series of movies. One thing that I say every time that we get a King Arthur movie or TV show is, that was good, but it wasn't what I would have done with a King Arthur movie or TV show. Well, now you know what I would do if I was doing a King Arthur movie or TV show. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and do you want to see me do stuff like this again in the future? This is the kind of thing that I love noodling around in my head. I love just thinking about, well, if they gave me the reins to King Arthur, if they gave me the reins to X-Men, Superman, Batman, I love thinking about what would I do if they gave me some movies to play around with. And obviously, I have no experience in making movies of any kind. I don't have any experience of any kind. So it probably wouldn't be good, but you know what? Maybe it would. Who knows? So let me know what you guys thought. In the meantime, I will see you guys tomorrow with an actual review. So I hope that you guys have a great rest of the day, and if you like this video, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys later. Have a good one.